The laundress was fired for theft, and the millionaire of the mansion asked her a question. Her answer brought him to his knees. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracked wooden shutters of the modest home in Rosewood. Samantha stood by the sink, her hands submerged in soapy water as she scrubbed the last of the dishes from the night before. Outside, the soft chirping of birds was interrupted only by the distant hum of a tractor from the nearby fields. It was a quiet life, one filled with routines, but Samantha had no time to dwell on monotony. Her mother, Eleanor, lay resting in the next room, her frail body a reminder of the illness that had overtaken her years ago. "Did you take your medicine, Mom?" Samantha asked, stepping into the small bedroom. Eleanor gave her a tired smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about me," she replied, though the weakness in her voice betrayed her words. Samantha adjusted the thin blanket covering her mother and sat on the edge of the bed. "I'll bring you something to eat before I head out," she said, brushing a strand of hair from Eleanor's face. Every morning was the same. Samantha prepared breakfast, ensured her mother was comfortable, and then walked nearly 3 miles to the Thompson estate, where she worked as a laundress. Despite the demanding schedule, she never complained. Her life revolved around caring for her mother and keeping their small household afloat. The Thompson mansion stood in stark contrast to Samantha's world. Its white columns stretched toward the sky, a symbol of wealth and power. The expansive gardens were meticulously manicured, and the driveway was lined with oak trees that seemed as old as the land itself. Inside, chandeliers glittered, and polished floors reflected the grandeur of the estate. Samantha often felt invisible here, blending into the background as one of many employees who worked tirelessly to maintain the house's pristine condition. Yet, she didn't mind. She found solace in her tasks, focusing on folding crisp linens and ensuring every garment was spotless. It was in these quiet moments of work that she felt a sense of purpose. "Good morning, Samantha." A familiar voice greeted her. She looked up to see Mr. Jack Thompson, the man of the house. His presence was commanding, yet his tone was always kind when he spoke to her. "Good morning, sir," she replied, her voice steady but polite. Jack had always been polite to Samantha, unlike his young wife, Amber. Where Jack carried himself with a quiet confidence, Amber radiated a sharpness that made Samantha uneasy. Amber's eyes would often scan Samantha as if searching for flaws, her lips curling in disdain at the simplest of mistakes. "Make sure you don't ruin that dress." Amber's voice cut through the room like a blade one afternoon. She stood in the doorway of the laundry room, her arms crossed, a perfect picture of suspicion. "It's worth more than your entire paycheck." Samantha bit her tongue, choosing to focus on her work instead of responding. She had learned long ago that defending herself only made matters worse. By the end of the day, Samantha's feet ached, and her hands were red from hours of washing and folding. As she walked home, the weight of the day pressed heavily on her. Yet, the thought of her mother waiting for her with a smile kept her going. At home, the scent of chicken broth filled the air. Eleanor had managed to prepare a small meal despite her frailty. Samantha smiled, her heart warming at the sight. "You didn't have to do this, Mom," she said, sitting down at the table. "I wanted to," Eleanor replied. "You do so much for me, this is the least I can do," as they ate. Samantha shared stories from her day, careful to leave out the harsher moments. Eleanor listened intently, her eyes sparkling with pride for her daughter's resilience. The next morning, Samantha repeated her routine. The sun rose, the birds sang, and she prepared for another day at the mansion. But this day would be different. It would mark the beginning of a series of events that would change her life forever. When Samantha arrived at the laundry room, she found Amber standing there with a scowl. In her hands, she held an elegant gown, one that Samantha had carefully cleaned the day before. "This is ruined," Amber exclaimed. Thrusting the dress toward Samantha, Samantha stared at it in confusion. The dress was immaculate when she left it. She knew she had done her job perfectly. "You've cost me hundreds of dollars," Amber continued. "This kind of carelessness won't be tolerated." Before Samantha could defend herself, Jack entered the room, his brows furrowed. Amber wasted no time explaining, twisting the story to make it seem like Samantha had been negligent. "I can't allow this," Jack said, his tone firm but regretful. "Samantha, I'm sorry, but we'll have to let you go." The words hit Samantha like a punch to the chest. Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to speak. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't do it. I would never." But her protests were drowned out by Amber's triumphant smirk. Samantha grabbed her belongings and left the mansion, her heart heavy with humiliation and anger. As she walked away, she turned back one last time, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her words cutting through the air. "I am your daughter." Samantha's words lingered in Jack's mind like a stubborn melody that refused to fade. "I am your daughter." The shock on his face had been unmistakable, but Samantha didn't stay long enough to see it. She had walked away, her shoulders trembling, leaving Jack rooted to the floor of the laundry room. Amber, on the other hand, had looked more amused than concerned, a smug grin spreading across her face. "That's absurd," Amber scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "She's just saying that to get sympathy." Jack didn't reply. His thoughts were swirling too fast, dragging him back to memories he had buried long ago. Could it be true? Could Samantha really be his daughter? The morning after Samantha's dismissal, the Thompson mansion carried an unusual quietness. Even the staff, who were usually bustling through hallways, seemed subdued. Jack sat in his study, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him as he stared blankly at the papers on his desk. The image of Samantha's tearful face haunted him. He thought back to Eleanor. It had been years, decades really, since he last saw her. They were young then, barely out of school, and deeply in love, but his parents had disapproved of Eleanor, calling her unsuitable for a Thompson. They had shipped him off to Europe to study and build his career, tearing apart a love he had believed would last forever. Jack exhaled heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. If what Samantha said was true, it meant he had a daughter, one he had never known. The thought brought an ache to his chest, but it also filled him with an undeniable need to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, Samantha was back in Rosewood, sitting by the window of their modest home. The morning sunlight illuminated her tired face, and her hands absent-mindedly toyed with the hem of her skirt. Her mother, Eleanor, was in the next room, unaware of the storm brewing in Samantha's life. "Mom, I need to talk to you," Samantha said softly, stepping into the room. Eleanor looked up from her knitting, her hands trembling slightly as she set the needles down. "What is it, dear?" Samantha hesitated, her heart pounding. "I told him, Mr. Thompson. I told him what you said, that he's my father." Eleanor froze, her expression shifting from surprise to something Samantha couldn't quite place. Fear, regret. "You shouldn't have done that," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why not?" Samantha asked, frustration seeping into her tone. "He deserves to know the truth. And we—" She paused, swallowing hard. "We deserve better than this, Mom. You shouldn't have had to struggle all these years alone." Eleanor sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. "It's not that simple, Samantha. There's so much you don't understand." "Then explain it to me," Samantha pressed, her voice trembling. "Because I'm tired of living in the dark." Eleanor looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "I'll tell you everything soon," she said quietly. "But not today. Please, just trust me for now." Back at the mansion, Jack decided he needed answers, ignoring Amber's dismissive attitude. He called in his butler, Henry, a man who had worked for the family for over 3 decades. "Henry," Jack began, his voice steady but firm, "I need you to find out everything you can about Samantha and her mother, Eleanor." Henry nodded without hesitation. "Of course, sir. I'll get on it right away." Amber overheard the conversation and couldn't hide her irritation. "Why are you wasting your time on this nonsense, Jack?" she asked, her voice sharp. "That girl is nothing but trouble." Jack fixed her with a cold stare. "You don't get to decide what's important to me, Amber." Amber's eyes narrowed, but she didn't push further. Instead, she turned on her heel and left the room, slamming the door behind her. A few days later, Samantha returned from the market to find an unfamiliar car parked outside her house. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, only to see Jack sitting in the small living room. He looked out of place, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the worn furniture and faded curtains. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and unease. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see Eleanor," Jack replied, standing up as she entered. "Is she home?" Samantha hesitated, glancing toward her mother's room. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Jack," Eleanor said softly, her voice tinged with both warmth and sorrow. For a moment, no one spoke. The air was heavy with unspoken words and years of separation. Finally, Jack broke the silence. "Eleanor?" he began, his voice cracking slightly. "Is it true? Is Samantha my daughter?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "Yes, Jack. She's yours." The weight of her words hit Jack like a tidal wave. He turned to Samantha, his eyes filled with both wonder and regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Samantha crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "And what difference does it make now?" she asked. "You've lived your life, we've lived ours. Why should anything change?" Jack looked at her, his heart aching. "Because I want to make it right. I want to be there for you now, in any way I can." Samantha shook her head, her voice sharp. "It's too late for that, Mr. Thompson. You can't just show up and fix everything." Jack turned back to Eleanor, his expression pleading. "Please, give me a chance to prove myself." Eleanor hesitated, but finally nodded. "You have a lot to make up for, Jack. But if you're serious about this, we'll listen." The days that followed Jack's visit to Rosewood were anything but peaceful. Samantha couldn't shake the emotion stirred by their conversation. She had spent years imagining what it might feel like to meet her father, if he even cared. But now, faced with the reality of his sudden appearance and promises, she felt more confusion than closure. Her mother, Eleanor, remained quiet, choosing her words carefully whenever Samantha brought up Jack. "He's trying," Eleanor would say softly. "Give him the chance to show you who he really is." But Samantha's walls were firmly in place. Years of hardship had taught her to rely on no one but herself and her mother. At the mansion, Jack had his own battles to fight. His resolve to uncover the truth and mend his relationship with Samantha was clear. But Amber's presence complicated everything. Her sharp remarks and bitter attitude toward Samantha only deepened Jack's frustration. "Amber, we need to talk," Jack said one evening, his voice calm but resolute. Amber glanced up from her glass of wine, her manicured fingers tapping against the crystal stem. "About what?" "Your little charity project." Jack's jaw tightened. "Samantha is my daughter. I won't tolerate your behavior toward her anymore." Amber laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Your daughter? You mean the girl who suddenly decided to show up claiming to be part of the family? Open your eyes." "Jack, she's after your money. Nothing more. She's not like that," Jack said firmly. "And deep down you know it." Amber stood, her expression hardening. "What I know is that you're letting some girl manipulate you. Don't expect me to just sit back and watch while you ruin everything we've built here." With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving Jack to grapple with his rising anger and the weight of her words. Unbeknownst to Jack, Amber's bitterness had already evolved into a plan. She was determined to rid herself of Samantha for good, and her strategy was simple: discredit her in Jack's eyes. The next morning, Amber descended into the laundry room with a cold smile, carrying an extravagant gown worth more than Samantha's annual wages. She set it down deliberately, ensuring the staff noticed. "This dress needs to be washed immediately," she announced, her tone dripping with condescension. "And make sure it's perfect. Not a single flaw." Samantha, who had been folding linens nearby, stepped forward. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice steady. Amber's smile widened. "Good. Let's see if you're as capable as Jack seems to think." Samantha ignored the veiled insult and got to work. She treated the gown with the utmost care, ensuring every detail was flawless before hanging it to dry. She felt a small sense of pride as she left the room that day, confident that she had done her job well. But by the time she returned the next morning, chaos awaited her. Amber stood in the center of the room, the gown clutched in her hands. A long tear marred the delicate fabric, and her face was a mask of outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" Amber demanded, her voice echoing through the room. "This dress is ruined. Do you have any idea how much it cost?" Samantha froze, her heart pounding. "That's impossible," she said, stepping closer to inspect the damage. "I handled it carefully. It was perfect when I left." Amber scoffed. "Perfect, look at it. This kind of negligence is unacceptable." Other staff members gathered, their whispers filling the air. Samantha's cheeks burned with humiliation as Amber continued her tirade. "I want her fired," Amber declared. Amber, turning to Jack, who had entered the room moments earlier. "She's clearly incompetent." Jack's eyes shifted between the ruined gown and Samantha's stricken face. "Samantha, is this true?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "No, it's not," Samantha said, her voice trembling. "I swear I didn't do this." Amber stepped closer, her expression one of mock sympathy. "Jack, I know you want to believe her, but we can't let personal feelings cloud our judgment. This is about standards." Jack hesitated, his expression conflicted. He had no reason to doubt Samantha's character, but the evidence was damning. I don't know what to say," Jack finally said. "Amber, let me think." "There's nothing to think about," Amber interrupted. "She's a liability, and keeping her here sets a bad example." Jack's hesitation was enough for Amber to press further. "You have to let her go, Jack. It's the only logical choice." Finally, Jack sighed, running a hand over his face. "Samantha," he said, his voice heavy. "I'm sorry, but I don't see how we can continue this arrangement." The words hit Samantha like a physical blow. She felt the tears welling in her eyes but refused to let them fall. "I didn't do it," she whispered. "I would never." But Amber cut her off. "Please, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Samantha turned to Jack, searching his face for any sign of understanding, but his eyes were fixed on the floor. Without another word, she grabbed her belongings and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused, her voice trembling as she spoke. "You'll regret this, Mr. Thompson, because the truth always comes out." With that, she left, her steps echoing in the grand hallway as Amber's triumphant smirk lingered in the room. Back in Rosewood, Samantha collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking. Eleanor rushed to her side, alarmed by the sight of her daughter's tear-streaked face. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Samantha shook her head, struggling to find the words. "They accused me of ruining a dress. They fired me, Mom, just like that." Eleanor's face darkened, a rare flash of anger crossing her features. "That woman, Amber, she's behind this, isn't she?" Samantha nodded, her voice breaking. "She hates me, Mom, and now I've lost everything." Eleanor pulled her daughter into an embrace, her own tears falling silently. "You haven't lost me, sweetheart," she said softly, "and we'll get through this. I promise." The mansion was quiet that evening, but Jack's mind was anything but. The words Samantha had spoken before she left. "You'll regret this, Mr. Thompson, because the truth always comes out," echoed relentlessly. He sat in his study, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth, his thoughts spinning between doubt and guilt. Eleanor's face appeared vividly in his memory, her bright eyes and warm laughter from decades ago. He had loved her once, deeply, but his parents had torn them apart. And now, Samantha's claim. Could it really be true? Jack picked up his phone and dialed Henry, his trusted butler. "Henry," he said, his voice firm despite his inner turmoil. "I need you to find out everything you can about Samantha and her mother." "Eleanor, I want details. Where they've been, what they've done, everything." "Yes, sir," Henry replied without hesitation. Jack ended the call, his jaw tightening. He knew this wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about atoning for the mistakes of his past. Meanwhile, Amber was celebrating her small victory. She sat in the grand dining room, a glass of wine in hand, as she relished the memory of Samantha's dismissal. "Problem solved," she muttered to herself, smiling smugly, but her confidence was short-lived. Jack's distant demeanor during dinner that evening was impossible to ignore. "Still thinking about that girl?" Amber asked, her tone sharp. Jack's eyes flicked up to meet hers. "Her name is Samantha," he said coldly. Amber rolled her eyes. "You're really letting this get to you, aren't you? She's just some girl looking for a payout." Jack's voice was low but firm. "I don't think she is, and I intend to find out the truth. Whether you like it or not." Amber's grip on her wine glass tightened, but she forced a smile. "Suit yourself," she said lightly. "Just don't let it interfere with the house. Or us." Jack didn't respond, and Amber felt a flicker of unease. In Rosewood, Samantha was doing her best to move forward, though the sting of the accusation still weighed heavily on her. She spent the next day tending to her mother and trying to suppress the anger bubbling inside her. Eleanor noticed Samantha's silence as they shared a modest lunch. "You've barely touched your food," she said gently. "I'm fine," Samantha replied. Though her tone betrayed her, Eleanor set down her fork and sighed. "You're not fine, Samantha, and you shouldn't be. What they did to you was wrong." Samantha's eyes filled with tears. "It's not just about the dress, Mom. It's everything. They look at me like I don't belong, like I'm nothing. And then Jack," she paused, taking a shaky breath. "He just stood there and let her win." Eleanor reached across the table, taking Samantha's hand. "Jack doesn't know the whole story," she said softly. "Maybe it's time he did." Samantha shook her head. "And what good would that do? It's not like he's going to magically make everything better." "Maybe not," Eleanor admitted. "But he deserves to know the truth, and so do you." 2 days later, Jack's car pulled up outside Eleanor's house. Samantha watched from the window, her stomach twisting with apprehension. "What's he doing here?" she muttered, more to herself than to Eleanor. Eleanor stood behind her, her expression unreadable. "Let him in, Samantha," she said quietly. Samantha hesitated before opening the door. Jack stood on the porch, his normally composed demeanor tinged with unease. "May I come in?" he asked. Samantha stepped aside reluctantly, and Jack entered the small living room. The space was humble but warm, filled with the faint scent of lavender and the soft creak of old furniture. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face pale but calm. "Jack," she said, her voice soft. Jack turned to her, his expression shifting to one of quiet vulnerability. "Eleanor," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Is it true? Is Samantha, my daughter?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Samantha crossed her arms, her jaw tight, as Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes, Jack," Eleanor said. "She's yours." The weight of her words settled over the room, and for a moment, no one spoke. Jack looked at Samantha, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Regret. Perhaps, or hope. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor, I had no idea." Eleanor's gaze softened, though her posture remained firm. "You didn't want to know, Jack. Your family made sure of that." Jack's jaw tightened. "I never stopped thinking about you, Eleanor, but I didn't know how to." "It doesn't matter now," Samantha interrupted, her tone sharp. "You lived your life, and we lived ours. Why should anything change?" Jack turned to her, his expression pleading. "Because I want to make it right," he said. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be part of your life now. Please, Samantha." Samantha stared at him, her heart warring with anger and something softer she didn't want to acknowledge. Finally, she shook her head. "It's not that simple," she said quietly. Eleanor stepped forward, placing a hand on Samantha's shoulder. "Jack," she said, her voice steady, "if you're serious about this, you'll have to prove it. Words aren't enough." Jack nodded, his gaze shifting between Eleanor and Samantha. "I will," he promised. "Whatever it takes, I'll prove it to both of you." That night, Jack returned to the mansion, his determination solidified. Amber greeted him with her usual coldness, but Jack ignored her. Heading straight to his study, he pulled out a small box from his desk drawer and opened it, revealing a faded photograph of Eleanor from years ago. The edges were worn, but her smile was as bright as he remembered. "I'll fix this," he murmured to himself. "I have to." Jack's promise echoed in his mind as he drove through the winding roads that led to Rosewood. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the fields, but his focus was elsewhere. He had spent the previous night reviewing every memory, every detail he could recall about Eleanor. The faded photograph he kept in his study had only strengthened his resolve. He needed to make amends, not just with Eleanor, but with Samantha too. When he arrived at the modest house, he hesitated before stepping out of his car. The last visit had been filled with tension, and he knew this one would be no different. Gathering his courage, he approached the front door and knocked. Eleanor opened it, her face calm but cautious. "Jack," she said simply, stepping aside to let him in. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady but soft. Samantha was seated at the small dining table, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Her gaze flicked to Jack for a moment before returning to the cup of tea in front of her. Jack cleared his throat, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, he began, his tone earnest, but I couldn't stay silent after everything. Then why didn't you say something when it mattered? Samantha's voice was sharp, her eyes now locked on his. Jack hesitated, the weight of her accusation sinking in. Because I didn't know, he said quietly. I didn't know you existed, Samantha. If I had, it wouldn't have made a difference. Samantha interrupted, her tone biting. You had your life, your family, your wealth. People like us don't matter to people like you. Samantha. Eleanor's voice was firm. Cutting through the tension, Jack raised a hand, his expression pained. It's okay, Eleanor. She has every right to feel this way. Samantha stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I don't want your apologies, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. I don't need your guilt or your promises. We've been fine without you and will continue to be. Before Jack could respond, she turned and left the room, leaving Eleanor and Jack in heavy silence. In the small kitchen, Samantha gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. Her heart was racing, and tears threatened to spill. She hated how vulnerable she felt in front of him, how much his presence stirred feelings she didn't want to confront. Samantha, Eleanor's voice called softly from the doorway. Please come back. I can't, Mom, Samantha replied, her voice breaking. He doesn't get to walk in here and act like he cares. Not after everything. Eleanor stepped closer, her expression gentle. I know it's hard, sweetheart, but holding on to this anger won't make it any easier for you. You deserve to hear him out. Samantha shook her head, wiping her eyes. He doesn't deserve that chance. Maybe not, Eleanor admitted, but you do. Jack remained in the living room, his eyes fixed on the worn rug beneath his feet. He felt the weight of the years he had missed, moments he could never get back. When Eleanor returned, she sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. She's hurt, Jack, Eleanor said, her tone soft but firm. And she has every right to be. I know, Jack replied, and I don't blame her, but I want to make things right. For both of you. Eleanor studied him for a moment before speaking. Words are easy, Jack. They're just air. Actions are what matter. Jack nodded. Tell me what I can do, he said. Eleanor sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. Start by proving to her that she's more than just an afterthought to you. She spent her whole life believing she wasn't enough for anyone to care about. Show her she's wrong. Jack leaned forward, his voice resolute. I will. Whatever it takes, Eleanor. I'll show her that she's not alone anymore. The following day, Samantha walked into the living room to find Jack gone. She was relieved, though a small part of her felt a pang of something she couldn't quite identify. Guilt. Regret. She shook the thought away and focused on the tasks at hand. There was laundry to do, errands to run, and her mother's medication to pick up. As she walked into town later that morning, her mind wandered back to Jack's words. There had been something in his voice, something genuine. It unsettled her, and she hated that it did. Her errands were interrupted when she noticed a familiar figure standing near the pharmacy. Jack was there, speaking to the pharmacist who handed him a small bag. Samantha frowned, her curiosity getting the better of her. What are you doing here? She asked, her tone sharper than intended. Jack turned, startled, but quickly recovered. I came to pick up your mother's medication, he said simply. Samantha stared at him, her frustration building. You don't have to do that. We've managed just fine without your help. I know, Jack replied, his voice calm. But I want to help now. Please let me. Samantha crossed her arms, unsure of how to respond. Finally, she sighed and turned away. Do what you want, she muttered, walking off without another word. Later that evening, Eleanor noticed the bag of medication on the table. Jack brought this, didn't he? She asked, glancing at Samantha. Samantha shrugged, her expression guarded. I didn't ask him to. Eleanor smiled faintly. Sometimes, Samantha, people do things because they care, not because they expect anything in return. Samantha didn't reply, but her mother's words stayed with her as she lay awake that night. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, Jack's intentions weren't as selfish as she had believed. Jack returned to the mansion late that evening, his mind heavy with the events of the day. Eleanor's words echoed in his ears. Actions are what matter. He knew she was right, But proving himself to Samantha was proving to be a greater challenge than he had anticipated. The wall she had built around her heart was nearly impenetrable, and Jack was painfully aware that he was responsible for its existence. As he stepped inside, the house was eerily quiet. Amber's absence from the dining room, where she usually sipped wine and entertained herself with petty gossip, struck him as unusual, but Jack wasn't in the mood to search for her. Instead, he headed straight to his study, where he intended to plan his next steps carefully. However, Amber had other ideas. "What exactly have you been doing in Rosewood, Jack?" Her voice rang out as she appeared in the doorway. Arms crossed and her expression icy, Jack glanced up from his desk, unbothered by her sharp tone. "You already know why I've been there," he replied evenly. Amber stepped further into the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Oh, I know you've been playing savior to that girl and her pathetic excuse for a mother," she said, her words dripping with venom. "But what I don't understand is why you're wasting your time. They're nothing to you." Jack's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Samantha is my daughter," he said firmly, "and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right with her and Eleanor." Amber laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "You're delusional. That girl is using you, Jack. Can't you see it? She's after your money, your name, whatever she can get her hands on." "You're wrong," Jack snapped, his voice rising. "Samantha doesn't care about any of that. All she wants is the truth and a chance to be heard. Something you've gone out of your way to deny her." Amber's eyes narrowed, her anger flaring. "Don't you dare blame me for this mess. You're the one who brought her into our lives. And let me remind you, Jack, that this house, this life, is as much mine as it is yours." Jack rose from his chair, his towering presence forcing Amber to take a step back. "This house," he said coldly, "belongs to me, and I won't let you or anyone else stand in the way of fixing what I broke." Amber's lips curled into a sneer. "You're making a mistake, Jack. Mark my words." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The next morning, Jack began his investigation into the accusation against Samantha. He knew Amber had orchestrated it, but he needed proof. Calling Henry into his study, he outlined his suspicions. "I want you to speak to the staff," Jack instructed. "Find out who handled that gown and when. There's no way Samantha would have been careless enough to damage it." Henry nodded. "I'll start immediately, sir." Hours later, Henry returned with the information Jack had been expecting but dreading. "It seems Mrs. Amber gave specific instructions to one of the maids," Henry reported. "She told her to keep quiet about handling the dress after Samantha left." Jack clenched his fists, his anger simmering just below the surface. "And the damage to the gown. The maid admitted that Mrs. Amber was the one who tore it. She claimed it was an accident, but, well, the timing is suspicious, to say the least." Jack exhaled slowly, his resolve hardening. "Thank you, Henry. That'll be all for now." As Henry left, Jack sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Amber's actions had crossed a line. Several, in fact. It wasn't just about Samantha anymore. It was about the principles Jack had once prided himself on. Allowing this deceit to continue would mean compromising those principles, and he couldn't let that happen. Amber, however, was oblivious to Jack's discoveries. She spent the day at the country club, indulging in gossip and shopping, unaware that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. When she returned to the mansion that evening, she found Jack waiting for her in the living room. His expression was calm, but there was an edge to his demeanor that made her pause. "What's with the look?" she asked, dropping her designer handbag onto the couch. "We need to talk," Jack said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Amber raised an eyebrow but sat down anyway, crossing her legs casually. "All right, let's hear it." Jack didn't waste time. "I know you planted that gown to frame Samantha." Amber's confident demeanor faltered for a split second before she recovered. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said smoothly. "Don't lie to me, Amber," Jack snapped, his voice sharp. "I've spoken to the staff. I know exactly what you did." Amber's face hardened, and for the first time, she looked genuinely nervous. "And what if I did?" she said, her voice lower but no less defiant. "She deserved it. That girl has no place here, Jack. She's nothing." Jack's eyes burned with anger. "She's my daughter," he said firmly. And if you ever try to hurt her again, you'll find yourself out of this house faster than you can pack a bag." Amber rose to her feet, her hands trembling with rage. "You would throw me out after everything I've done for you." "Everything you've done has been for yourself," Jack retorted, "and I won't let you drag this family through your lies any longer." Amber stared at him, her chest heaving, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. Jack sank back into his chair, the weight of the confrontation settling over him. He knew this was only the beginning of the battle ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he was taking a step in the right direction. Samantha woke to the faint sound of her mother coughing in the next room. The sound had become all too familiar over the years, a painful reminder of Eleanor's fragile health. Tossing off the thin blanket that covered her, Samantha quickly rose and went to check on her. "Mom," she called softly as she pushed open the door. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, her hand clutching a tissue. "I'm fine," Eleanor said, her voice hoarse but reassuring. Samantha frowned, crossing the room to sit beside her. "You're not fine. You need proper care, Mom. I can't keep ignoring this." Eleanor reached out, her frail hand brushing Samantha's cheek. "We've managed this long, haven't we?" Samantha shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "But at what cost? You're getting worse, and I can't keep pretending everything's okay. Something has to change." Eleanor sighed, but said nothing. Samantha knew her mother hated being a burden, but the truth was undeniable. Without help, Eleanor's condition would only deteriorate further. Later that morning, Samantha left the house with a renewed sense of determination. She walked into town, her thoughts racing. The small savings she had managed to scrape together were dwindling fast, with no job and no prospects. The weight of their situation pressed heavily on her. As she passed the pharmacy, the memory of Jack standing there with her mother's medication resurfaced. She bit her lip, conflicted. She hated the idea of accepting his help, but Eleanor's health wasn't something she could gamble with. "I'll figure it out," she muttered to herself, shaking the thought away. Her errands were brief, and she returned home with a few groceries, carefully choosing only what was absolutely necessary. As she walked through the door, she found Eleanor sitting at the small kitchen table, a piece of paper in her hands. "What's that?" Samantha asked, setting the bags down. "It's a letter from the hospital," Eleanor replied, her voice subdued. "They're reminding me about the tests I need to schedule." Samantha felt a pang of guilt. She had been delaying those tests, knowing they couldn't afford them. Now, the letter was a harsh reminder that time wasn't on their side. "We'll figure it out," Samantha said quickly, forcing a smile. "Don't worry about it, Mom." Eleanor's expression softened, but worry lingered in her eyes. "You've been saying that for years, sweetheart. I know how much you've given up for me. I just wish..." She trailed off, her voice breaking. Samantha knelt beside her, taking her hands. "You're my mom," she said firmly. "There's nothing I wouldn't do for you. We'll get through this, I promise." Meanwhile, Jack was finalizing plans of his own. The confrontation with Amber had only solidified his resolve to help Samantha and Eleanor. He had spent hours on the phone, contacting doctors and specialists who could provide the care Eleanor so desperately needed. "Everything's arranged," he told Henry that afternoon. "The hospital will cover all her expenses, and I'll make sure Samantha doesn't have to worry about a single thing." Henry nodded, his expression approving. "That's a generous gesture, sir. But do you think Samantha will accept it?" Jack hesitated. "She'll resist, I'm sure, but this isn't about her pride. It's about Eleanor's health. She may hate me for it, but I can live with that if it means Eleanor gets the help she needs." The next day, Jack arrived in Rosewood unannounced. Samantha opened the door, her surprise quickly turning to irritation. "What are you doing here again?" she asked, crossing her arms. Jack held up a folder. "I made arrangements for your mother's treatment. Everything's covered. The tests, the medication, the follow-ups. You don't have to worry about a thing." Samantha's eyes narrowed. "And you think you can just fix everything with money? That's not how this works, Mr. Thompson." "I'm not trying to fix everything," Jack replied, his tone calm but firm. "I'm trying to help. Let me do this for her. For you." Samantha shook her head. "We don't need your charity." "This isn't charity," Jack said, stepping closer. "It's the least I can do after everything you've been through because of me." Samantha stared at him, her emotions warring inside her. On one hand, she hated the idea of accepting his help. On the other, she couldn't deny that Eleanor needed it. "Think about it," Jack said quietly. "That's all I'm asking." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving the folder on the small table by the door. That evening, Samantha sat alone in the living room, staring at the folder. The details inside were clear: appointments with top specialists, full coverage of all expenses, even transportation to and from the hospital. It was everything they needed but couldn't afford. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her expression gentle. "What is it, sweetheart?" Samantha hesitated before holding up the folder. "Jack made arrangements for your treatment. He's paying for everything." Eleanor's brows furrowed. "And what did you say?" "I told him no," Samantha replied, her voice wavering. Eleanor sat beside her, taking the folder from her hands. "Why, Samantha? Why would you refuse something that could help us?" "Because it feels wrong," Samantha admitted, tears brimming in her eyes. "After everything we've been through, it feels like giving in." Eleanor placed a hand on her daughter's cheek. "Sometimes, accepting help doesn't mean giving in. It means letting someone make up for their mistakes. Jack has a lot to make up for, Samantha. Maybe this is his way of starting." Samantha looked away, her heart heavy. "I just don't know if I can trust him." "Trust takes time," Eleanor said softly. "But right now, we don't have the luxury of pride. We need this, Samantha. I need this." Samantha nodded slowly, the weight of her decision settling over her. She would accept Jack's help, for her mother's sake, but she wasn't ready to forgive him just yet. The days following Samantha's reluctant acceptance of Jack's help were tense. She avoided thinking too much about what it meant, or the strings that might be attached. Her focus remained on Eleanor, who was finally able to schedule the long-delayed medical tests. Jack had ensured everything was arranged without complications. The local hospital staff treated Eleanor like a priority, and Samantha couldn't help but notice the difference. It was a strange feeling, relief mixed with unease. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, least of all a man who had been a stranger for most of her life. One afternoon, as Samantha sat in the hospital waiting room, flipping through an outdated magazine, her thoughts drifted to Jack. Despite her anger and mistrust, she couldn't deny that his efforts seemed genuine. The question gnawed at her. Why now? Her train of thought was interrupted when the doctor emerged from Eleanor's room, smiling kindly. "She's doing well," he said. "The tests went smoothly. We'll have the results soon." Samantha nodded, murmuring her thanks as the doctor walked away. She exhaled deeply. One small hurdle cleared, but the larger ones remained. Meanwhile, Jack was digging deeper into the events surrounding Samantha's dismissal from the mansion. He couldn't shake the feeling that Amber's actions had been calculated, and his conversation with Henry had only confirmed his suspicions. "Henry," Jack said, summoning his butler to the study one evening. "I want you to call in the maid who handled the dress, discreetly. I need to hear her account firsthand." Henry nodded. "I'll arrange it, sir." The following morning, the maid arrived at the study, visibly nervous. She fidgeted with her apron as Jack gestured for her to sit. "There's no need to be afraid," Jack said gently. "I just need the truth." The maid hesitated, glancing around the room before finally speaking. "Mrs. Amber told me to bring her the dress after Miss Samantha left," she admitted. "She said it needed to be checked for stains, but when I returned later, it was torn. Mrs. Amber told me not to say anything." Jack's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Thank you for your honesty," he said, dismissing her with a nod. As the maid left, Jack leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped tightly. Amber had gone too far, and the time had come to confront her actions. Head on. Amber was lounging in the garden when Jack found her later that day. She was flipping through a magazine, the picture of calm indifference. "We need to talk," Jack said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Amber sighed dramatically, setting the magazine aside. "What now, Jack? More about your little charity case?" Jack's expression hardened. "Samantha isn't a charity case. She's my daughter, and I won't let you get away with what you did to her." Amber blinked, her facade faltering for a brief moment before she regained her composure. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "I know you framed her," Jack said, his voice cold. The maid confirmed everything. You tore the dress and planted the evidence to make it look like Samantha was at fault. Amber stood, her eyes narrowing. And what if I did? She doesn't belong here, Jack. She's nothing but trouble, and you're too blind to see it. She's my daughter, Jack snapped, his voice rising. And if you ever try to hurt her again, there will be consequences. Amber smirked, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. You're all talk, Jack. You don't have it in you to do anything about this. Try me, Jack said, stepping closer, because I've had enough of your lies and manipulations. This is your final warning, Amber. If you cross the line again, you won't have a place in this house, or my life. Amber's confident demeanor wavered, but she refused to back down. You're making a mistake, she hissed. You'll regret this. Without another word, she stormed off, leaving Jack standing in the garden. The next day, Jack visited Rosewood again. Samantha was outside, tending to the small garden in front of their house, when she spotted his car approaching. What now? She muttered under her breath, brushing dirt from her hands as he stepped out of the car. Jack approached her cautiously, his expression serious. I wanted to let you know that I've taken care of the situation, he said. What situation? Samantha asked, crossing her arms. The one that led to your dismissal. Jack replied, Amber framed you. She tore the dress and blamed you for it. Samantha's eyes widened, shock and anger flashing across her face. And you're only figuring this out now. Jack winced at her tone, but didn't back down. I should have seen it sooner, and for that I'm sorry. But I'm making it right. I've already confronted Amber, and I plan to clear your name publicly. Samantha stared at him, her emotions churning. Part of her wanted to yell, to demand why it had taken him so long to stand up for her. But another part, the part she didn't want to acknowledge, felt a small flicker of gratitude. I don't need a public apology, she said finally, her voice quieter. I just want to be left alone. Jack nodded, though her words stung. I understand, but I hope in time you'll see that I'm trying to do the right thing. Samantha said nothing, watching as he returned to his car and drove away. That evening, Samantha told Eleanor about Jack's revelation. He admitted Amber framed me, Samantha said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Eleanor smiled faintly. It sounds like he's trying, Samantha. Maybe it's time to let him. Samantha shook her head. It's not that easy, Mom. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust him. Eleanor reached for her hand. Trust takes time, sweetheart. But at least he's taking the first step. That's more than most people do. Samantha didn't reply. But her mother's words stayed with her as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. The air in Rosewood felt lighter in the days following Jack's revelation about Amber's scheme. Although Samantha remained guarded, a subtle shift had begun to take place. Jack's actions, however small, had planted the seed of possibility. Perhaps he was genuinely trying to make amends. Samantha spent most of her days caring for Eleanor, who was now preparing for her follow-up appointments at the hospital. The tests had provided clarity, and the recommended treatments, fully funded by Jack, were set to begin the following week. One morning, as Samantha prepared breakfast, Eleanor spoke up, her tone unusually firm. You should thank him, Samantha. Samantha froze mid-motion, the toast in her hand hovering over the plate. Thank him, she echoed, her voice tinged with disbelief. Yes, Eleanor said, meeting her daughter's gaze. He didn't have to do any of this, but he did. That means something. Samantha sighed, setting the plate down. I know, Mom, it's just complicated. Eleanor smiled gently. Most things in life are, sweetheart, but that doesn't mean you should close every door before it's even fully open. Later that day, Jack arrived at the house with a quiet knock on the door. Samantha opened it cautiously, still unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. Good afternoon, Jack greeted her, his tone warm but careful. He held a brown paper bag in his hands. What's that? Samantha asked, nodding toward the bag. Lunch, Jack replied with a faint smile. I thought we could all sit down together and talk. If that's all right with you. Samantha hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward Eleanor, who was already smiling warmly from the living room. Come in, she said finally, stepping aside. Jack entered, setting the bag on the kitchen table. He unpacked its contents: sandwiches, fresh fruit, and a small box of cookies. Eleanor's eyes lit up at the sight, and Samantha couldn't help but notice how at ease her mother seemed in Jack's presence. As they ate, Jack shared stories from his younger years. He spoke of his travels and the business ventures that had consumed most of his life. For the first time, Samantha saw glimpses of the man her mother had once loved. "You know," Jack said, turning to Eleanor, "I always regretted not reaching out to you after my parents sent me away. I let their expectations dictate my life, and it's a mistake I'll always carry with me." Eleanor smiled sadly. "We were young, Jack, and we both made choices we thought were right at the time." Samantha listened quietly, her emotions swirling. The conversation felt raw and honest, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that Jack's intentions might truly be sincere. Over the next few weeks, Jack's visits became more frequent. He often brought small gifts, fresh flowers for Eleanor, books for Samantha, and once, a basket of baked goods from a local cafe. Each gesture was thoughtful and unobtrusive, slowly chipping away at Samantha's defenses. One afternoon, Jack arrived with a small stack of papers in hand. "I've been working on something," he said, placing the papers on the table. "What is it?" Samantha asked, eyeing the documents warily. "It's a plan," Jack explained. "I've spoken to some people in town, and I think we can set up a business that benefits Rosewood and its residents. Something sustainable, something that gives back to the community." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "And you expect me to be involved?" Jack smiled. "Only if you want to be. I thought this could be a way for us to work together. Something meaningful for both of us." Samantha studied the papers, her skepticism warring with curiosity. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her tone cautious. "That's all I ask," Jack replied, his smile softening. Eleanor watched these interactions with quiet hope. Though Samantha remained guarded, she could see her daughter beginning to soften, her edges slowly smoothing as Jack continued to show up, not with grand promises, but with consistent, small acts of care and effort. One evening, as Samantha prepared dinner, Eleanor spoke up. "You know, he's trying, sweetheart, he really is." Samantha didn't respond immediately, focusing instead on chopping vegetables. Finally, she sighed. "I know, Mom, and I want to believe him. I just don't know how to let my guard down." Eleanor reached for her hand, stopping her mid-motion. "You don't have to do it all at once," she said gently. "Just take it one step at a time." The next morning, Samantha found herself standing in the garden, pulling weeds and trimming overgrown plants. Jack arrived just as she was finishing, his sleeves rolled up and a determined expression on his face. "Need a hand?" he asked, holding up a pair of gardening gloves. Samantha blinked, momentarily taken aback. "You're offering to help with the garden?" "Why not?" Jack replied with a shrug. "It's been a long time since I've done anything like this, but I'm willing to give it a shot." Samantha hesitated before nodding. "All right, just don't expect me to go easy on you." Jack chuckled. "Wouldn't dream of it." As they worked side by side, a comfortable silence settled between them. For the first time, Samantha allowed herself to enjoy his company, even if just a little. "You're not terrible at this," she admitted after a while, glancing at the row of neatly trimmed bushes Jack had managed. "High praise," Jack replied with a grin, brushing dirt from his hands. Samantha rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her lips. That evening, as she recounted the day to Eleanor, Samantha found herself laughing at one of Jack's failed attempts to uproot a particularly stubborn weed. "You're starting to see it, aren't you?" Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling. "See what?" Samantha asked, though she already knew the answer. "That he's not just trying," Eleanor replied. "He's showing you who he really is." Samantha didn't respond, but as she lay in bed that night, she realized her mother might be right. Amber paced back and forth in the lavish bedroom she had once considered her throne. The walls, adorned with ornate paintings and gilded mirrors, now seemed to close in around her. Jack's growing bond with Samantha gnawed at her, a constant reminder that her grip on the Thompson empire was slipping. She had underestimated Samantha once, assuming the girl was no match for her. But now, with Jack's unwavering attention and determination to mend the relationship with his daughter, Amber felt the ground beneath her shifting. She couldn't let this continue. Grabbing her phone, she dialed a number she hadn't used in years. When the line clicked, a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Amber," the voice drawled. "It's been a while. I need a favor," Amber said curtly, her tone sharp. "Favors aren't free," the voice replied, amusement lacing his words. Amber smirked, her confidence returning. "Oh, you'll be well compensated. But I need this done discreetly." The voice chuckled darkly. "Discreet is my specialty. What's the job?" Amber hesitated, then spoke quickly, outlining her plan. As she finished, the man on the other end gave a low whistle. "You really don't like this girl, do you?" "It's not about her," Amber snapped. "It's about what's mine, and I don't intend to lose it." The next day, Jack spent the morning reviewing documents in his study. He was deep into plans for the community project he had proposed to Samantha, though she hadn't fully committed. Her tentative interest was a promising start. Jack smiled to himself, envisioning a future where they could work together, building something meaningful for Rosewood and beyond. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Henry stepped in, his expression uncharacteristically tense. "Sir, there's something you should know," Henry began. Jack set down his pen, giving his butler his full attention. "What is it?" "There are rumors circulating among the staff," Henry said cautiously. "It seems Mrs. Amber has been meeting with unsavory individuals." Jack frowned. "What kind of individuals?" Henry hesitated before replying. "The kind that could cause trouble. I don't have all the details yet, but it's clear she's planning something." Jack's jaw tightened. He had given Amber one last chance to step back and reflect on her actions, but it seemed she was determined to cross the line again. "Keep an eye on her," Jack said finally, "and let me know the moment you hear anything else." Henry nodded. "Of course, sir." Meanwhile, Amber's plan was already in motion. She had instructed her contact to dig into Samantha's past, hoping to find something, anything that could be used against her. If Samantha's reputation was tarnished, Jack's faith in her would crumble, but Samantha's life was far from scandalous. The investigator found no evidence of wrongdoing, no hidden secrets. Frustrated, Amber decided to fabricate her own version of the truth. She crafted a letter, its contents laced with lies and innuendos. In it, she accused Samantha of using Eleanor's illness as a sob story to manipulate Jack. The letter painted Samantha as an opportunist, a girl who had appeared out of nowhere to exploit Jack's wealth and generosity. Amber folded the letter neatly and sealed it in an envelope. She placed it on Jack's desk, ensuring it would be the first thing he saw when he returned to his study. Later that evening, Jack found the envelope waiting for him. He opened it with mild curiosity, but as he read the contents, his expression darkened. The accusations were cruel, the language venomous. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in Jack's mind. Could Samantha's actions be a carefully calculated ploy? But as quickly as the doubt arose, he dismissed it. He had seen Samantha's sincerity, her quiet strength, and the sacrifices she had made for Eleanor. None of it aligned with the person described in the letter. Jack's anger simmered as realization dawned. Amber was behind this. He crumpled the letter in his fist and left the study, his steps purposeful as he headed toward the dining room, where Amber sat enjoying her evening glass of wine. "Amber," he said, his voice icy as he entered. Amber looked up, feigning innocence. "Jack, is something wrong?" Jack threw the crumpled letter onto the table. "You tell me," he said. "Is this your idea of discreet?" Amber's smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't insult my intelligence," Jack snapped. "You've gone too far, Amber. First, you framed Samantha for theft, and now this. How much lower are you willing to stoop?" Amber's eyes flashed with defiance. "I'm trying to protect you, Jack. Can't you see that? She's using you." "She's my daughter," Jack interrupted, his voice rising. "And I won't stand by while you try to destroy her." Amber stood, her composure cracking. "You're choosing her over me." "I'm choosing what's right," Jack said firmly. "And if you can't accept that, then you have no place in my life, or this house." Amber's lips curled into a sneer. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. Jack stepped closer, his gaze unyielding. "The only thing I regret is not seeing you for who you really are sooner." Without another word, Amber stormed out of the room, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts. That night, Jack wrote a letter of his own. It was a formal request for divorce, one he knew would mark the end of a tumultuous chapter in his life. Amber's reign over the Thompson household was coming to an end, and Jack felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. As he sealed the envelope, he thought of Samantha and Eleanor. For the first time, He allowed himself to hope. For reconciliation, for redemption, and for a future where the mistakes of the past could finally be laid to rest. The tension in the Thompson mansion reached its peak in the days following Jack's confrontation with Amber. She had retreated to her room, seething with rage and plotting her next move. Jack, however, was resolute. He was done tolerating Amber's manipulations and lies. His decision to move forward with the divorce was a quiet one. For now, he had instructed his lawyer to prepare the necessary paperwork and was waiting for the right moment to confront Amber publicly. In the meantime, he focused on his plans for Samantha and the community project in Rosewood. Jack's determination to right his wrongs extended beyond his relationship with Samantha. For years, he had allowed his wealth and influence to shield him from the realities of those around him. Now, he was determined to use his resources to make a meaningful impact. Meanwhile, Samantha was beginning to notice the subtle changes in Jack. He visited more frequently, often bringing small updates about the Rosewood project, or stopping by just to check on Eleanor. His presence was no longer an intrusion. It was becoming a part of their routine. One morning, as Samantha and Eleanor sat in the kitchen discussing Eleanor's upcoming treatment, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," Eleanor called, smiling as Jack stepped inside. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, holding a box of pastries. "Not at all," Eleanor replied warmly. "You're just in time for tea." Samantha, though less enthusiastic, couldn't deny the way her mother's spirits seemed to lift whenever Jack was around. She gestured for him to sit, her tone polite but guarded. "What brings you here today?" she asked. Jack hesitated, then placed the box on the table. "I wanted to share something with you," he said, pulling out a folder. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, leaning forward. "It's the finalized plan for the Rosewood project," Jack explained, opening the folder to reveal detailed blueprints and proposals. "I want your input, Samantha. You know this community better than anyone. Your perspective could make all the difference." Samantha studied the papers, her expression softening as she realized the depth of Jack's commitment. "I'll take a look," she said finally, her tone less frosty than before. Back at the mansion, Amber's patience had worn thin. She had tried to manipulate Jack, intimidate Samantha, and undermine Eleanor, but nothing had worked. Now, she felt cornered, and a cornered animal was always dangerous. Her opportunity came in the form of a grand charity event Jack had planned to host at the mansion. The event, intended to raise funds for the Rosewood project, would be attended by prominent figures from across the state. Amber saw it as the perfect stage to reclaim her position, or destroy Jack's reputation entirely. On the night of the event, the mansion buzzed with activity. The grand ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and golden decor, a testament to the Thompson family's wealth and status. Guests mingled, glasses of champagne in hand as soft music played in the background. Amber, dressed in a striking red gown, descended the staircase with a calculated smile. She moved through the crowd effortlessly, greeting guests and basking in the attention she had always craved. But her eyes were constantly searching for Jack, for Samantha, for the perfect moment to strike. Jack stood near the entrance, greeting guests and answering questions about the Rosewood project. Samantha and Eleanor had reluctantly agreed to attend. At Jack's insistence, Eleanor, ever gracious, looked radiant in a simple but elegant dress Jack had gifted her. Samantha, meanwhile, kept to the edges of the room, observing the scene with cautious curiosity. Amber's approach was swift and deliberate. She stopped in front of Jack, her smile sharp as a blade. "Lovely event, darling," she said, her tone sweet but laced with malice. "Amber," Jack replied coolly, his posture stiffening. "I hear this little project of yours is making waves," Amber continued, her voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of nearby guests. "It's wonderful to see you so invested." Jack narrowed his eyes, sensing her ulterior motive. "If you have something to say, Amber, say it," he said evenly. Amber's smile widened. "Oh, I think I'll let the guests decide." She turned to the crowd, her voice rising. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a moment to appreciate Jack's newfound sense of charity. Isn't it inspiring?" The room grew quiet as Amber continued, her tone turning venomous. "But let's not forget the reason behind this sudden burst of generosity. After all, it's easy to feel charitable when you're trying to clean up your own mess." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Jack's expression darkened. "Amber, that's enough." "Oh, I'm just getting started," Amber said, turning her attention to Samantha, who stood frozen near the edge of the room. "Let's talk about the real reason Jack's so invested in Rosewood, his long-lost daughter, who conveniently appeared just in time to reap the benefits of his wealth." Samantha's face burned with humiliation, and Eleanor reached for her hand. Offering silent support, Jack stepped forward, his voice firm and commanding. "Amber, you've crossed the line." Amber smirked. "Have I? Or am I just saying what everyone here is already thinking?" Jack turned to the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Yes, Samantha is my daughter, and yes, I've made mistakes. But those mistakes are mine to own, not hers. She has done nothing but face every challenge with strength and integrity, and I won't stand by while she's slandered." The room erupted into murmurs, but Jack silenced them with a raised hand. "If anyone here has a problem with the truth, they are free to leave, but I will not tolerate lies or disrespect in this house." Amber's face twisted with fury as she realized her plan had backfired. The guests, instead of rallying to her side, looked at her with disdain. One by one, they turned away, resuming their conversations as if she no longer existed. Jack approached Samantha and Eleanor, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Samantha nodded, though her voice was shaky. "I think so." Eleanor smiled gently. "You handled that well, Jack." As Amber stormed out of the ballroom, Jack felt a sense of closure. The chapter with her was finally coming to an end, and he was ready to focus on the future. With Samantha and Eleanor by his side, the morning after the dramatic charity event, the Thompson mansion was unusually quiet. Amber's explosive departure had left the staff whispering in hushed tones, but Jack paid them no mind. His focus was entirely on ensuring Samantha and Eleanor were all right. Samantha, however, woke that morning with a lingering unease. The humiliation of being put on display in front of strangers still weighed heavily on her. As much as she appreciated Jack's defense, part of her resented being thrust into such a spectacle. She wasn't used to this level of attention, and it left her feeling exposed. Eleanor, sensing her daughter's unease, brought her a cup of tea as they sat in their small living room. "You were brave last night," Eleanor said softly. "Brave," Samantha echoed, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "I didn't do anything but stand there while Amber tore into me. And you held your head high," Eleanor replied firmly. "That counts for something, Samantha. It shows strength." Samantha sighed, staring into her cup. "I just don't know if I belong in all of this, Mom. This isn't our world. It's as much your world as anyone else's," Eleanor said. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Jack arrived at their house later that morning. His expression unusually serious. Samantha opened the door, folding her arms as she met his gaze. "I came to apologize," Jack began. "For last night, I never should have allowed Amber to get that far." Samantha hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. "It wasn't your fault," she said, her voice quieter now. "But it's not something I want to go through again." "You won't have to," Jack assured her. "Amber's actions crossed every line, and I've taken steps to ensure she's no longer a problem." Eleanor, seated nearby, raised an eyebrow. "Steps. I've filed for divorce," Jack said simply. Samantha's eyes widened. "You did what?" "It was long overdue," Jack replied, his tone firm. "Amber and I haven't been a true partnership in years. I tolerated her for far too long, and last night was the final straw. I need to move forward. For all of us." Samantha didn't respond immediately, processing his words. Finally, she nodded. "I guess that's your decision to make." Jack took a deep breath, shifting gears. "There's something else I need to do," he said. "I want to formally restore your honor, Samantha. The people in my life need to know the truth about who you are and what you're not." Samantha frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm hosting a dinner at the mansion," Jack explained. "For the staff and some close associates, it's not a grand event. Just an opportunity to set the record straight." Samantha hesitated, her initial instinct to refuse. But Eleanor placed a hand on her arm, silently encouraging her. "All right," Samantha said finally. "But only if you promise no speeches or theatrics." Jack smiled, relieved. "No theatrics, I promise." The dinner was scheduled for the following weekend, and Jack spent the days leading up to it personally ensuring everything was in place. He wanted the evening to be perfect, a small but meaningful gesture to show Samantha that she was valued and respected. Samantha, on the other hand, approached the evening with a mix of anxiety and resignation. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she trusted her mother's advice to give Jack the benefit of the doubt. When the night arrived, Samantha and Eleanor entered the mansion together, both dressed in simple but elegant outfits. The dining room was warm and inviting, the table set with care and attention to detail. Jack greeted them at the door, his expression earnest. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice sincere. Eleanor smiled graciously. "It's good to see you putting so much thought into this, Jack." Samantha said nothing. Though her guarded demeanor had softened slightly, the dinner began with casual conversation. The atmosphere surprisingly relaxed. The staff who had worked alongside Samantha in the laundry room offered warm smiles and kind words, a stark contrast to the tension of her final days working there. As the meal progressed, Jack stood to speak. Despite his promise of no theatrics, Samantha shot him a pointed look, but he raised a hand in reassurance. "I won't take long," he said, his tone gentle. "I just want to take this moment to say something important." He turned to Samantha, his expression softening. "You've been through more than anyone should have to endure. And yet, you've handled it with grace and strength. You've shown me what it truly means to face challenges head-on, and I couldn't be prouder to call you my daughter." Samantha felt her cheeks flush as murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Jack continued, addressing the rest of the table. "Samantha's dismissal from this house was a mistake that never should have happened, and for that, I take full responsibility. I want everyone here to know that she was innocent of the accusations made against her. She is, and always has been, someone of integrity and character." The applause that followed was unexpected but genuine. Samantha glanced at her mother, who smiled warmly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Jack sat down, his expression earnest as he met Samantha's gaze. "I hope this is a step toward making things right," he said quietly. Samantha nodded slowly. "It's a start," she replied, her voice steady that night. As they returned to Rosewood, Eleanor looked at Samantha with pride. "You held your head high tonight," she said. "Maybe," Samantha replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But I think Jack's the one who needed it more than I did." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Perhaps, but it doesn't change the fact that you deserved it." As Samantha lay in bed that night, she found herself reflecting on Jack's words. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were finally on the path to something resembling a family. The days after the dinner brought an unfamiliar sense of calm to Samantha's life. Jack's public acknowledgement of her innocence and his efforts to mend their relationship had softened some of the walls she'd built around herself. Though she was far from fully trusting him, she couldn't deny that his actions spoke louder than his words. For Eleanor, the shift was a welcome relief. Her health was improving steadily thanks to the treatments Jack had arranged, and she now moved about the house with more energy and purpose. Seeing her mother regain her strength brought Samantha a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as Samantha watered the small garden in front of their house, Jack's car pulled up along the gravel road. He stepped out with a cautious smile, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. "For you," he said. Handing them to her, Samantha raised an eyebrow. "Wildflowers, huh? Aren't you supposed to bring something fancier?" Jack chuckled. "I thought these felt more... you?" Samantha smirked despite herself and took the flowers. "Thanks," she muttered, tucking them into the crook of her arm. "So, what brings you here today?" Jack's expression turned serious. "I wanted to talk to both of you about something important. Is your mom inside?" "She's in the kitchen," Samantha said, nodding toward the door. Jack followed her inside, where Eleanor greeted him warmly. "Jack, it's always a pleasure to see you," she said, gesturing for him to sit at the small kitchen table. "Thank you, Eleanor," Jack replied, taking a seat. Samantha sat across from him, her arms crossed as she waited for him to speak. Jack hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," he began, "and I realized that the mansion, my home, feels empty without the right people in it. I'd like to invite both of you to come and live there with me." Samantha blinked, caught off guard. "Live there, with you?" "Yes," Jack said earnestly. "I know it's a big change, and I don't expect an answer right away, but the house has more than enough space, and it would give Eleanor access to care and comfort without any limitations." Eleanor glanced at Samantha, her expression thoughtful. "That's a generous offer, Jack," she said. "It's more than generous," Samantha interjected, her tone wary. "But why now? Why us?" Jack met her gaze, his expression steady. "Because you're my family, and I want to do everything I can to make up for the years I wasn't there." Samantha looked down at her hands, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, but the idea of leaving their little house in Rosewood felt daunting. "Take your time," Jack added, sensing her hesitation. "I just want you both to know that the invitation is always open." Over the following days, the idea weighed heavily on Samantha's mind. Eleanor, however, seemed more optimistic. "It's a chance for us to move forward," Eleanor said one evening as they sat together on the porch. "You've spent so much of your life fighting, Samantha. Maybe it's time to let someone else help." "I don't want to depend on him," Samantha replied, her voice tinged with frustration. "Accepting help isn't the same as depending on someone," Eleanor said gently. "And you don't have to do this for him. Do it for us. For yourself." Samantha sighed, her gaze drifting to the stars above. "I just don't know if I can trust it, Mom. What if it doesn't work out?" Eleanor reached for her hand, squeezing it softly. "That's a risk we take with anything in life, but sometimes the risk is worth it." A week later, Samantha made her decision. She and Eleanor packed their modest belongings, and Jack sent a car to bring them to the mansion. The drive was quiet, filled with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. When they arrived, the staff greeted them warmly, their smiles genuine and welcoming. Jack was waiting at the entrance, his expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Welcome home," he said simply, stepping aside to let them in. The mansion, once an intimidating symbol of wealth and power, now felt different. Jack had made subtle changes to create a warmer, more inviting atmosphere. The dining room, once formal and imposing, now featured a cozy table adorned with fresh flowers. Eleanor's room was on the first floor, fully furnished with everything she might need for her comfort. Samantha's room, however, left her speechless. It was spacious but not ostentatious, with soft, calming colors and a small reading nook by the window. On the desk sat a stack of books about fashion design, a subject Samantha had once loved but abandoned when life's responsibilities took over. "How did you know?" Samantha asked. "Samantha," her voice barely above a whisper. Jack stood in the doorway, smiling softly. "Your mother mentioned it. I thought it might be a way to reconnect with something you care about." Samantha nodded, unable to find the right words. That evening, the three of them shared dinner in the smaller family dining room. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with laughter and stories. For the first time, Samantha felt a glimmer of what a real family might look like, a family she never thought she'd have. As the meal ended, Jack raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice steady. Samantha hesitated, then raised her glass as well. "To new beginnings," she echoed. Eleanor smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "And to family." Later, as Samantha sat by the window in her new room, gazing at the moonlit gardens below, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in years. Hope. Perhaps this new chapter wouldn't erase the struggles of the past, but it offered something far more precious, a chance to build something better. For the first time in a long time, Samantha felt like she belonged. Life at the Thompson mansion was unlike anything Samantha had ever experienced. The grand halls, polished marble floors, and sprawling gardens were a world away from the modest home in Rosewood. Yet, amidst the luxury, Samantha found herself struggling to adjust. She wasn't used to being waited on, or having everything she needed at her fingertips. Eleanor, on the other hand, settled in quickly. The comfort and care she received were improving her health more than Samantha could have imagined. Watching her mother regain strength brought Samantha a sense of relief, though it didn't erase her lingering doubts about their new arrangement. Jack, true to his word, continued to make efforts to build a relationship with Samantha. Every morning, he joined them for breakfast, sharing his plans for the day and asking about theirs. While Samantha still maintained her guarded demeanor, she couldn't deny that his presence was consistent and genuine. One morning, as they sat in the sunny breakfast room overlooking the garden, Jack placed a small folder on the table in front of Samantha. "What's this?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Take a look," Jack said, leaning back in his chair with a faint smile. Samantha opened the folder to find detailed sketches and plans for a fashion studio. Her breath caught as she flipped through the pages, each one outlining a dream she had long since buried. "I remembered what your mother said about your interest in design," Jack explained. "This is just an idea, but I thought we could set up a space for you to explore it again, if you're interested." Samantha stared at the papers, her emotions warring within her. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," Jack replied, "but I want to. You gave up so much to take care of Eleanor. Now it's time to do something for yourself." Eleanor, seated nearby, smiled warmly. "He's right, sweetheart. You deserve this." Samantha hesitated, her fingers brushing over the sketches. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice steady but cautious. The following days were filled with quiet moments of connection. Samantha began spending more time with Jack, accompanying him on walks through the gardens or helping him review plans for the Rosewood project. While she still maintained some distance, the barriers between them were slowly starting to erode. One afternoon, Jack invited Samantha to visit the Rosewood site. The project was progressing quickly, with construction crews bustling and new facilities beginning to take shape. "This is all for the community," Jack said, as they walked through the site. "A place for people to learn new skills, find opportunities, and build better lives." Samantha nodded, impressed by the scale of the project. "It's a good idea," she admitted. "Rosewood needs something like this." Jack smiled. "I'm glad you think so. I was hoping you'd want to be involved. Your insight could make all the difference." Samantha tilted her head, studying him. "Why do you care so much about what I think?" "Because you're smart, capable, and you understand what this community needs better than I ever could," Jack replied. "And because I want to do this with you, Samantha. Not for you, with you." For the first time, Samantha felt the weight of his sincerity. She nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "All right, let's see what we can do." Back at the mansion, Eleanor was thriving. The staff adored her, often stopping to chat or bring her small gifts from the market. Her laughter filled the halls, a sound Samantha hadn't heard in years. One evening, as Samantha helped Eleanor prepare for bed, her mother took her hand and smiled. "You've changed, sweetheart," Eleanor said. "Changed how?" Samantha asked, curious. "You're starting to let people in," Eleanor replied. "It's a beautiful thing to see." Samantha chuckled softly. "I guess I'm trying. It's not easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is," Eleanor said, squeezing her daughter's hand. "But you're doing it, and I couldn't be prouder." Amber, meanwhile, had not been idle. Though her presence at the mansion was no longer welcome, she had not disappeared entirely. Her bitterness over Jack's decision to prioritize Samantha and Eleanor had only deepened, and she was determined to regain control. Through old connections, Amber began spreading rumors about Jack's business dealings, hoping to tarnish his reputation and undermine the Rosewood project. She knew it would take time, but she was willing to play the long game if it meant regaining her place of power. Jack, however, was one step ahead. He had anticipated Amber's retaliation and had already begun fortifying his business against potential sabotage. With the help of his legal team and trusted advisors, he ensured that every aspect of the Rosewood project was transparent and above reproach. When news of Amber's schemes reached him, he addressed them calmly but firmly. "She won't stop," Jack admitted to Samantha one evening as they sat in the study. "She's desperate," Samantha replied. "And desperate people make mistakes." Jack nodded. "I just want to make sure her mistakes don't hurt anyone else, especially you or Eleanor." "We'll be fine," Samantha said, her voice steady. "We've survived worse." Jack smiled faintly. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met, Samantha. I hope you know that." As the weeks passed, the mansion began to feel less like a gilded cage and more like a home. Samantha found herself laughing more, sharing stories with Eleanor and even Jack. The tension that had once defined their relationship was fading, replaced by a cautious but growing bond. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the cozy family room, Jack looked at Samantha and Eleanor, his heart full. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "Have what?" Samantha asked, glancing at him. "A family," Jack said simply. Samantha's gaze softened. And she nodded. Neither did I. Eleanor reached for both of their hands, her smile radiant. But we do now, she said, and for the first time, Samantha allowed herself to believe it. The serenity that had begun to settle over the Thompson mansion was interrupted one morning by an unexpected knock at the door. Henry, the butler, opened it to find a courier holding a sealed envelope addressed to Jack. The sender was Amber. Henry delivered the letter to Jack, who was in the study reviewing the latest reports from the Rosewood Project. As soon as he saw Amber's signature scrawled on the back of the envelope, a sense of dread crept over him. He opened it carefully, scanning the letter's contents. Amber's words were sharp and calculated. She threatened to go public with what she called damning information about Jack's past business deals and personal life. She claimed to have evidence that could destroy his reputation and, by extension, the Rosewood Project. Jack set the letter down, his jaw tightening. Amber's attempts to manipulate him had reached new heights, but he refused to let her jeopardize everything he had worked for, especially his growing bond with Samantha and Eleanor. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer. "I've received a letter from Amber," he said. "She's threatening to release false information about me. I want to take immediate action." Meanwhile, Samantha noticed Jack's unease throughout the day. Though he tried to mask it, she could sense something was wrong that evening. As they sat in the family room with Eleanor, Samantha decided to address it. "You've been distracted all day," she said bluntly. "What's going on?" Jack hesitated, glancing at Eleanor before meeting Samantha's gaze. "It's Amber," he admitted. "She's trying to sabotage the Rosewood Project. And me." Samantha's expression hardened. "What's she planning?" "She claims to have information that could damage my reputation," Jack replied. "But I'm confident it's all fabricated." Eleanor frowned, her voice soft but firm. "Jack, you can't let her intimidate you. The truth always comes out." Samantha nodded. "If she's lying, she'll slip up. People like her always do." Jack smiled faintly at their support. "I appreciate that, but I need to be proactive. I won't let her undo everything we've worked for." The next day, Jack called a meeting with his legal team and PR consultants. They devised a plan to counter Amber's threats, including issuing a preemptive statement that reinforced the transparency of Jack's business practices and the integrity of the Rosewood Project. At the same time, Henry discreetly gathered information about Amber's activities. It didn't take long for him to uncover the source of her fabricated claims, an old associate of hers who had a history of unethical dealings. Armed with this information, Jack prepared to confront Amber directly. Amber, however, wasn't backing down. She had arranged a meeting with a tabloid journalist, hoping to sell her story and gain the public leverage she craved. But just as she was about to leave for the meeting, Jack arrived at her temporary apartment, unannounced. "What are you doing here?" Amber demanded, her voice sharp as she opened the door. Jack stepped inside, his expression calm but steely. "We need to talk." "I don't have time for this," Amber snapped, crossing her arms. Jack held up a folder. "You might want to make time. I know where you've been getting your so-called evidence, and I have proof that it's all fabricated." Amber's confidence faltered, but she quickly masked it with a smirk. "So what? People will believe what I tell them. That's the power of perception, Jack." Jack stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You're playing a dangerous game, Amber. If you go through with this, it won't end well for you. Not only will you lose any remaining credibility, but you'll also face legal consequences." Amber's smirk faded as the weight of his words sank in. For the first time, she realized she might have underestimated him. "You've already lost everything you had here," Jack continued. "Don't make it worse for yourself." Amber stared at him, her mind racing. Mind. She wanted to lash out, to fight back, but deep down, she knew Jack was right. She had pushed too far, and now the walls were closing in. That evening, Jack returned to the mansion feeling lighter. The confrontation with Amber had been draining, but he was confident that her threats had been neutralized. He joined Samantha and Eleanor for dinner, their laughter filling the room as they shared stories from the day. "You seem more at ease," Eleanor observed, her eyes twinkling. Jack nodded. "I am. Amber won't be bothering us anymore." Samantha studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. She's caused enough damage." Eleanor reached across the table, placing a hand on Jack's. "You've handled this with grace, Jack. That's not always easy." Jack smiled, his gratitude evident. It's easier when I have both of you by my side." Later that night, Samantha found herself sitting by the window in her room, gazing at the moonlit gardens. She thought about everything that had happened, the chaos Amber had caused, the way Jack had stood firm, and the quiet strength her mother had shown through it all. For the first time, Samantha felt a sense of stability. The mansion, which had once seemed like an intimidating symbol of power and privilege, now felt like a sanctuary. And while she still had her reservations, she couldn't deny that Jack had proven himself in ways she hadn't expected. Eleanor's words from weeks ago echoed in her mind. Sometimes, the risk is worth it. Samantha smiled faintly, a feeling of hope blooming within her. Meanwhile, in a small, dimly lit office across town, Amber sat alone, staring at the letter Jack had left behind after their confrontation. Her hands trembled as she reread his warning, the reality of her situation sinking in. For the first time in years, Amber felt truly defeated. She had spent so long clinging to power and control that she hadn't realized how much she had lost in the process. Tears filled her eyes as she crumpled the letter and tossed it aside. She had no choice now but to let go, and to face the consequences of her actions. The days following Jack's confrontation with Amber were remarkably calm. The mansion, once a stage for tension and conflict, was now a place of warmth and quiet joy. Samantha noticed the difference in herself too. She no longer felt like a stranger in her father's home. Instead, she felt like a part of something she never thought she'd have. A family, Eleanor, growing stronger each day, spent her mornings in the garden, often joined by Jack. The two shared stories from their youth, their laughter drifting through the open windows of the house. Samantha would listen from a distance, a small smile playing on her lips. It was a scene she never could have imagined just a few months ago. One morning, as Samantha was reviewing designs in the fashion studio Jack had helped her set up, he appeared in the doorway. "How's it coming along?" he asked, gesturing to the sketches spread across the table. Samantha looked up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It's getting there," she said with a modest smile. "I'm still figuring things out." Jack stepped inside, picking up one of the sketches. It was a sleek, modern design for a dress, the lines clean yet elegant. "This is incredible," Jack said sincerely. "You've got real talent, Samantha." She shrugged, though her cheeks flushed with pride. "It's just an idea, nothing concrete yet." Jack set the sketch down and met her gaze. "You've spent so much time taking care of everyone else. It's time you let yourself shine." Samantha felt a lump rise in her throat at his words. For so long, she had been the one holding everything together, the one sacrificing her dreams for the sake of her family. Hearing Jack's support meant more than she cared to admit. "Thanks," she said softly, as the Rosewood project neared completion. Jack invited Samantha to join him for a tour of the site. The community center was almost ready, its freshly painted walls and bright, welcoming spaces, a testament to months of hard work. Walking through the building, Samantha couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had contributed to this, helping Jack shape the programs and outreach initiatives that would benefit countless people in the community. "This is going to change lives," Samantha said, her voice filled with awe. Jack smiled. "That's the goal, and it wouldn't have happened without you." Samantha glanced at him, her guard finally starting to come down. "You've changed too, you know," she said. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Oh, how so?" "You're not the man I thought you were when we met," Samantha replied. "You've surprised me," Jack chuckled. "Good surprises, I hope." Samantha smiled faintly. "Yeah, good surprises." Eleanor, ever perceptive, noticed the shift in Samantha's demeanor. That evening, as they sat together in the cozy living room, she broached the subject. "You seem lighter these days," Eleanor said. Sipping her tea, Samantha tilted her head. "Lighter? Yes," Eleanor replied with a knowing smile. "Like you're finally letting go of the weight you've been carrying for so long." Samantha sighed, setting her cup down. "I guess I am. It's just hard to let myself believe that things can really be different." Eleanor reached for her hand. "You've been through so much, sweetheart, but you've also come so far. Jack has too. You're not the same people you were at the beginning of this journey." Samantha nodded, her mother's words sinking in. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. The grand opening of the Rosewood Community Center was a day filled with celebration. Families from the village gathered to explore the new facilities, their faces lighting up with hope and excitement. Jack gave a brief speech, thanking everyone who had contributed to the project, but he made sure to emphasize Samantha's role. "Samantha's insight and dedication have been invaluable," he said, his voice steady and proud. "This project wouldn't be what it is today without her." Samantha stood among the crowd, her cheeks flushing as people turned to applaud her. For the first time, she allowed herself to bask in the recognition, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known she was missing. After the ceremony, Jack pulled Samantha aside. "You've built something incredible here," he said, "and I'm proud of you." Samantha met his gaze, her eyes softening. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jack smiled. "We're a team now, and that's not going to change." Back at the mansion, the three of them, Jack, Samantha, and Eleanor, shared a quiet dinner together. The conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and warmth. As the meal wound down, Jack cleared his throat, his expression turning serious. "There's something I'd like to propose," he said. Samantha and Eleanor exchanged curious glances. "I'd like to officially change my will," Jack continued, "to include both of you, not just as beneficiaries but as equal partners in everything I do. This house, the business, the projects, I want us to share it all as a family." Samantha's eyes widened. "Jack, I don't even know what to say." "Say yes," Eleanor said with a chuckle. Jack smiled warmly. "This isn't just about money or property. It's about building something together, something that lasts." Samantha took a deep breath, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's do it. Together." That night, as Samantha stood on the balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The journey had been long and painful, but it had brought her to a place she never thought she'd find: home. For the first time, she truly believed in the possibility of a brighter future, not just for herself, but for the family they had rebuilt from the ashes. And this time, she knew they would face it together.